Welcome, everyone. Hello, hello. My name is Tony Shawala. My pronouns are she and her, and I am the Senior Connection, Culture, and Operations Lead with RSA US. I am joining from what is now known as Northwest Ohio, which is located on the traditional lands of the Potawatomi, Kickapoo, Kikaskia, Peoria, and Miamia peoples. If you happen to be new to the RSA, welcome. Let me introduce you. Um, RSA US is a 501(c)(3) affiliate of the RSA, which is a 272-year-old organization with a global membership of nearly 30,000 folks dedicated to using ideas, connection, and collaboration to solve, today's challenges. And here in the US, we bring together about 1,250 folks to turn big ideas into real world impact through events, partnerships, and local initiatives. We connect people from diverse fields, spark unlikely collaborations, and co create solutions that last. If you're interested in learning more about becoming a fellow, feel free to visit the link that my amazing colleague who is supporting today's event, Claire Byrne, will soon be popping into the chat there. There's also a code there, RSA US 10. If you're interested in becoming a fellow, you can use that for 10% off annual dues and waive the registration fee. In addition, to intentionally curating the content of events that we host, we're always aspiring to show up in ways that will facilitate inclusive, safe, authentic, collaborative, respectful, kind spaces that promote learning and support our purpose. So to solidify this, you will see listed on the screen, we have a series of ways that we are committed to showing up. Please take a moment, look them over, make sure that you are in agreement with caring for ourselves and one another in all of these ways. We also invite folks to add any suggestions or ideas in the chat around these norms and ways of showing up. It's something that we're ever evolving as we're continuing to learn how to embody our values more. I'm going to shift to now our speakers being on the screen and share a few last minute logistic details for today before I hand it off to them. So the introduction and the panel for today's conversation are going to be recorded. We're going to do some breakouts later and larger conversations. Those won't be recorded. Within about 1 to 2 business days, you will get a follow-up email with any links that are shared in the chat during today's session, as well as the recording. The recording will also be available on our YouTube page. Feel free to be fully present during this session, knowing that we're going to capture all of those links and the recording so you can enjoy and engage in the ways that work best for you. If you do need anything during today's session, please do reach out to myself or my amazing colleague, Claire, who is joining us as well. And with that, I will turn it over to our moderator today, the wonderful Elizabeth Woodson.
Thank you so much, Tony, and so great to see a wonderful community convene today. I am Elizabeth Woodson, she, her. I live on the Muskogee Native lands, homelands of the Muskogee people, which is now known as Montgomery, Alabama. I run an organization called Reckon With. We activate white people to respond to, interrupt, and repair racial harm and injustice every day as it arises within us and with our family, friends, neighbors, and colleagues. We get to be here today. I know that this is a community that really believes in the power of social capital, and the RSA does such a wonderful job of celebrating that in many different ways. Today, we're convening for a little bit of a different purpose to actually examine the shadow side of social capital and to actually try to understand better how social capital perpetuates inequality and inequity. And James Baldwin is someone that, of course, inspires many of us. I am one of those inspirees. And there's a quote that always has stuck with me that I just want to name here to kind of invite us into a spirit of curiosity and a frame to take today's content through. And that is, he talks about how all people and really all things are both unprecedented miracles and also disasters. And often we spend a lot of time focused on the miracles of things, right? Celebrating the good. And what he also points out is that to truly love something, to truly understand it, you have to look at also the disasters, all of the nooks and crannies and all of the different sides. So today, we are gathering to do just that, to really examine the disasters side of social capital and connection, and to confront that together in a really deep inquiry and reflection. So I appreciate in advance your courage and your willingness to be part of this conversation. And I'm very grateful now to get to pass it to our three incredible panelists to introduce themselves and share a little bit about themselves and their work. So I'll pass it over to you, Dr. Okoroji.
Hey everyone. That was an awesome quote and introduction. I feel excited for the rest of this conversation. My name's Celestin Okoroji. I formerly worked for the RSA as a head of research. I'm an academic in social and cultural psychology, and I run a nonprofit at the moment that is focusing on epistemic justice, which is looking at how we bring communities into the interpretation of big data. And maybe I'll say some more later, but that's enough for now.
Can't wait. Thank you so much. Julia, can you introduce yourself?
Yes, absolutely. Hi, thanks, Liz. Thanks all for joining. My name is Julia Freeland Fisher. I'm the Director of Education Research at the Clayton Christensen Institute, which is a nonprofit, nonpartisan think tank that studies innovation across the public and social sector. I lead our education work, but for the past decade have been really squarely focused on what it will take for schools, nonprofits, community-based organizations to build young people's access to social capital and their ability to mobilize those networks in service of economic mobility. And delighted to be here. So grateful to the RSA for all the work you've done to connect the dots of people in different verticals and different parts of the world focused on this topic.
Wonderful. And Mike.
Hi, everyone. So excited actually to be here. That quote was fantastic. Had me going in my head in a good way. But I'm Mike O'Brien, super excited for the combo. Really situated in Philadelphia, and our work here is situated between two orgs. So I have a research lab at Drexel University that focuses on the future of wealth, work, and asset building for populations that have been cut off from those opportunities, whether that's because of geography, because of gendered choices, like women not being able to access credit for most of American history. So we look at things in that world, and then we have a for-profit side to our work, which really dives deeply in the world of workforce development, supporting employers who are trying to make massive changes around centering humanity in the context of their organizational prerogatives, KPIs, et cetera, while still not betraying, if you will, the bottom line, right? They got to stay profitable. They got to stay growing. But there's a way to do that that doesn't betray our humanity. And so we try to help folks figure that out.
Wonderful. So we are going to dive into a couple questions for each of you. But to start, I am going to share a little bit of historical context. I definitely identify as a part of the nerd community, and I think that is always so important as a place to start. It also is part of my journey. I spent 3 years working at the Equal Justice Initiative, which really was a profound honor and an education that I had not received in any of my college or other educational spaces about the actual history of injustice and the truths of the United States. So as we begin this conversation looking at social capital and connection, I really want to start us thinking about how we got to where we are today. The way that social capital and networks exist was very intentionally designed to segregate, to separate, to disconnect, right? And in so doing, to hoard and maintain resources and power within specifically one group, right? People racialized as white. and to disconnect and to preclude anyone else from being part of that. So it's a very intentional design that we are experiencing. And this goes back to the beginning before the actual start of the country 250 years ago, to the 1600s, when European settlers came to this land and started to architect a system of disconnection and segregation. There's a case in Virginia, the Virginia colony in 1640, of a man named John Punch, who was an indentured servant at the time. He was of African descent. He and two other indentured servants ran away, tried to get out of their servitude. And the other two people were what we now know as white, right? Racialized as white, although at the time those constructs were not yet totally firmed. But there were these three people that did the same thing, right? Tried to run away and escape into their freedom. And the Virginia Assembly legislated that there would be different punishments for each of the three. Actually, two of the three, the two white people, received a penalty of an extra 4 years of servitude. But John Punch, again, the one Black person in this case, was sentenced to life imprisonment, right? And that was the beginning of the creation of this separation based on this construct of race to separate and to disconnect. And there were laws then throughout the 1600s that reinforced that and created a lifelong and hereditary form of chattel slavery that was unique as of that time to the world. And then you see this in laws across the country, from the Deep South out to Idaho, in the segregation, the era of legalized apartheid, right? What we know as kind of following the Civil War, the Jim Crow era. So the second half of the 19th century and the 20th century. And I just want to pause to name how specific the legislation was to separate and to segregate. They didn't just say you can't be together, right? It was deeply precise. So I want to give some examples. There was a town in Alabama, Easley, Alabama, that legislated that barbers not only had to have separate chairs and spaces within their shops, but they were not allowed to use the same utensils, not the same brushes, not the same, what are the other things that barbers use? You all know what I'm talking about, but the actual implements, they were not allowed to be the same for Black and white people. In Birmingham, Alabama, they legislated the games that could not be played with Black and white people. Checkers, chess, dominoes, billiards, these games could not be played together, no matter where they were, right? Even if you're outside on the curb, you could not play these games together. And in Idaho, there was a series of anti-miscegenation laws passed that said that white people were not allowed to marry Black people, people of color. And the thing about that that's so important for us to understand is that at the time, this was in 1921, the percentage of the population in Idaho of Black people was 0.02%. So virtually, again, because of segregation and policy, right, there were virtually no Black people in the state, and still they spent this effort and energy to pass legislation to segregate and disconnect. And so I name these things to just have us be very clear-eyed about the current status of our connection and lack thereof. And right now, actually just this year, there was a study done that showed that 90% of white people's social networks are other white people. So that level of segregation and separation is still deeply intact. And that was a study done by the Public Religion Research Institute. It was replicated from a study done about 15 years ago. And that figure at that time was 91%. So we've gotten 1% better, but obviously that's virtually an unchanged situation. So that is really the context in which we now find ourselves asking these questions about how social capital further perpetuates inequities. And we really want to make sure that we're grounded in the long legacy of the current reality that we now see. So I'd love to ask you, Dr. Okoroji, if you can ground us in this conversation in an understanding of the human wiring, the neurobiology behind social connection.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Elizabeth. I think I'm going to just say three quick points and try to keep it a bit brief. I think the first thing to say is we don't often think about this, but human beings, we hold our babies in something called the supine position. This is kind of like on your back. And this is kind of unique to humans, but the one of the purposes of that is to facilitate face-to-face interaction, turn taking, mirroring, affect matching, pointing, all of these kind of activities. So from the moment of birth, almost you're in an environment that is um, supposed to facilitate um, social connection with your caregivers. And other animals don't really do this. And then another aspect about human beings, which is interesting, is um, a unique ability to share intention with each other. And human life doesn't really function without this ability to kind of read each other's minds about what's going on. So almost um, all of our activity, to some extent, functions with the presumption that all parties understand what kind of activity is supposed to happen, what their roles are, what other people's roles are, etc. And if you've got kind of neurotypical children, you can test this with them. So you can, start to build some blocks and then kind of accidentally let one block fall, and the child will often pick up that block and put it where it's supposed to go. So this is about kind of understanding each other, um, and that level of kind of understanding, that level of mind reading is also kind of unique, and it's what allows us to have kind of our social institutions in a way. So, money is the kind of main example. Money is just a thing that we agree together has value, and outside of that has kind of no meaning or purpose whatsoever, right? It's just that we all agree that this is what this does. This is what these pieces of paper um, mean. You can also think about it in terms of sport. I know in America you call it soccer, but we call it football over here. There's 22 players on a football field. Every single one of those players, um, especially at a high level, has an understanding of where all other players are, what they're doing, what their intentions are, etc. So this is kind of like fundamental to like human cognition, if you like. And then just taking it one step further to say something about um, identity. And I know there are a lot of kind of social forces sort of pushing us towards an understanding of the self as an individual. But in reality, most of the way that we think about ourselves and others is as members of groups, right? So we are in this meeting today as fellows of or people who are affiliated to the RSA, and therefore we share this kind of group identity. And the salience of groups shifts with the context, of course. Um, so at work, we're members of organizations. There may be rival organizations that we like or don't like. We're also members of or perceived to be members of racial groups or gender groups. Um, and certain institutional action, particularly in your US context, happens to us because we are or are not seen as members of a particular national group or religious group, and so on. So almost all of human life is um, moving through the world as members of groups. And sometimes we can think about this kind of groupishness as like a kind of modern artifact, but again, it's kind of fundamental to human psychology. And it's one of the few areas of social psychology that sort of survived, um, let's say, changing methodological tastes. Okay, so methods are changing. The way that we think about methods is changing a lot, but this really has survived this replication crisis, as we call it. And one of the key things that we know is that as human beings, we tend to favor members of our in-group. Okay. and that's both emotionally and materially. And we have kind of experimental evidence about this, even from kind of made up groups, right? So you can put someone in an experimental situation, make up a group that didn't previously exist before this experiment, and then ask them to, distribute some kind of resources, and they'll tend to distribute those resources more towards in-group members. Okay, so we almost can't really escape that idea, although I can say some things about how we might use that to do better. But more perniciously, and this is my final point, under certain conditions, right? So real or perceived conflict over social or material resources, which could be things like status, but also could be land, etc. That in-group favoritism can become out-group derogation and more so direct discrimination, etc., etc. And you can understand how this leads to many of the atrocities that we've seen over the decades of history, and today in our rhetoric and action towards certain groups. So my conclusion is this is it. We are social animals. There's no Homo economicus. It's like we are social creatures. Everything we are in terms of our cognition is built to work within a social environment where there are other people who we need to get along with or not get along with. It's really well connected to this whole idea of social capital and how we might discuss its shadow side.
Thank you. That is so helpful and really clarifying to understand some of the neurobiological infrastructure. So thank you for starting us off there. Mike, I'd love to turn to you as someone that thinks about design every day, all day. How do you see this neurobiology that Dr. Okoroji has just laid out for us? How do you see that being used and or misused in how systems and structures are designed?
Yeah, one, I loved everything that you mentioned, Cell, and great pickup, right? Homo economicus. There's a different naming and framing that some researchers have put together over time, homo neurons, right? To talk about and speak to our proclivity towards story and narrative as both an organizing infrastructure, but also a building type of tool for infrastructure socially, and I think in that context, I always look at design, and we're in a bit of, I'm going to try not to go too hard on the design thing because I think we're in a world where we love to do designy things. Like everybody loves a sticky note. Everybody loves to cluster and have their Sharpies and have sticky notes, right? And I love all of that. But you actually have to do stuff once you've clustered. Like design has multiple steps. There's a process. You should be getting towards an endpoint of a design process for you to test things out and learn from it, refine and keep learning and iterate and make it better and do it again. And so we leave a lot of that out. And I think about that a lot in the context of whatever we're then trying to say we're putting design methodology towards in the world. And in this context, when we're talking about economic mobility, we're talking about economic opportunity, we are talking about social design on top of some other forms of design that we're really trying to like dig into and play with. And so in that context and building again on what Sal was talking about with the concept of we are not Homo economicus. And I'm not even here to promote like we are homo neurons, but I think there's more than enough data to say that even if as an individual you do not predominantly organize your own personal life through stories, we have data on that. Everyone's not constantly working with a narrative. A lot of people do. We have data on that, but everyone doesn't. Society, however, when we go up the next couple of concentric circles, society does operate on narratives and stories. Society does use narrative as a tool to consolidate power, to determine how we're going to think about things. And so I want to quickly give a metaphor that I learned early in my like narrative journey. I would like to call it narrative intelligence journey. And it's a technical term that folks can please look up, narrative intelligence. There's a lot to do with actually early research into what we're seeing with large language models. But in that context, when I was on my learning journey there, There's a metaphor I read that really struck me, and it said, if you think about a strand of pearls as a necklace, every individual pearl on the necklace is a story. The narrative is the entire necklace together, right? That an individual pearl by itself is a nice thing. But if you want a functional necklace that is going to do the next level up of signifying certain types of things to people when you wear it, how you wear it, when you wear it, what event are you wearing it to, right? Like that, you need a necklace for that. And so the narrative that we have to, or the power of narrative, I think we have to sit in is that narratives are, and I'll give you an example of a narrative, right? The model minority narrative, or, let's take one, let's go even further, the American dream narrative, right? Because there's so many different stories underneath it that hold it up as a quote unquote truth, even though it's not necessarily a fact, right? The reality is then you get into model minority narratives or sub narratives under that, and there are a ton of other stories under that sub narrative that hold it up. And so people bring up Oprah, people bring up Barack Obama, people will bring up, fill in the blank and go, well, yeah, 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 bootstrap it. You can, I can, we all can. And we keep repeating those narratives over and over. Narratives also don't need to be true, though, because the welfare queen narrative has been disproven over and over and over again. I mean, it's one of the most easily researchable narratives to just put into Google and read about and go like, oh boy, that was all fabricated. It's a mess. The data are not there to back that up, even in 2026. But there was something powerful I observed in during Barack Obama's presidency, where Newt Gingrich called him the food stamp president. And as a designer, I laughed. I said, that's so brilliant. You are the power of narrative. We don't even got to rescript the whole thing. I don't even have to tell you the whole thing over again. That one phrase pulled 30, 40 plus years of narrative power and shaping and social infrastructure to a moment in like 2012 or whenever it was, or 2011, to try to push the country to believe about a bunch of different things about a lot of groups of people, including white people. And so I bring all that up because the reality here, going back to a neurobio perspective, and I'm going to be finishing up here in 2 seconds. Design is heavily about structuring the problem accurately, or the opportunity, or the challenge at hand. You have to spend more time in discovery research than you are typically comfortable with. Or if you are one of us nerdy designy people and you love discovery research, you got to socialize your clients to like, we need a little more time here. We can get you some crystallized outputs and products while we're going along this learning journey. But if we don't structure this right, this could be the difference of an extra comma on your balance sheet, or an extra zero on your balance sheet at the end of the year that you don't want, because we didn't frame the problem correctly. And so with all this neurobio stuff and everything I'm even talking about with like how narratives work at a really high level, I think it's important. I want to bring up a book called Imagination by a brilliant journalist, Jim Davies. It's a fantastic tour de force of the mechanics, if you will, both psychologically and biologically, neurobiologically and socially, of how imagination works. And in that book, he brings up the work of a woman named Eleanor Amit, where she's done enough research to say with some conjecture that the body tends to look at things that are physically, psychologically, or socially distant from it. If the body perceives deep distance, it's going to imagine with words. For things that are close or proximal, it's going to imagine with pictures. From a neurobio perspective, pictures to the brain and body are a lot more visceral in terms of their emotional elicitation and activation of the brain and body circuitry. Much more visceral responses than you're going to get with words. So if someone believes that threat or danger is imminent across any one of those three dimensions I mentioned, the physical, psychological, or social, it is going to shape what you then believe and perceive to be true as you subsequently start moving towards socializing, or excuse me, solutionizing, and trying to figure out what you are trying to solve, trying to shape the problem correctly. So narratives are shaping design even when we don't understand that narratives are at play. You've been hearing stories about groups of people, including your own, since you were a child, before you were verbal, if verbal capacity was going to come online for the brain. So there are unconscious and conscious things rolling around in our brains and bodies. They're shaping how we're making decisions at individual levels. They're shaping how we're making these decisions and how we're even contextualizing what the economic opportunity issue or economic mobility issue is, and therefore how social capital works. And I said I was going to end here. I'm really going to end right here. Class dynamics are a thing we have to like dig into because those welfare queen narratives, as an example, play on poor and lower class white people and harm them as much as they're harming people of color, because people that are not of color, white Americans, are predominantly using more of those resources than people of color. But the narrative manipulation allows for people to see themselves not in a group that they're actually a part of getting that type of needed and, I will say in my own language, deserved, because they're humans, deserved assistance, because no one should be going hungry in 2026 in America. But that narrative interplay and the way it can be manipulated, it's something we've got to think about as we're trying to figure out what is that root here when social capital isn't working out the way that we think it should, or when it's only structured by and in certain ways, by certain people in certain ways.
Mm. I hope y'all are taking notes. There is a lot to dig into with everything you just shared, Mike. Thank you. That built so beautifully off of what Dr. Okoroji laid out for us. Um, so to your point, Mike, I'd love to ask you, Julia. Obviously, a lot of folks on this call and in this community work to try to strengthen social capital. And we often, the language, the narrative, to your point, Mike, is often that social capital can be built, right? And I would love if you can talk and share about what underlying assumptions are in that framing that we should be questioning.
Yeah. Ooh, these feel like hard acts to follow. So I'm going to try and connect some dots, but also Mike and Sal like chime in. We can make this conversational if you want to build on anything I'm saying or correct me. I think like one thing to point out is that I think these efforts to build social capital are efforts, to use Dr. Okoroji's language, to engineer in-groupness. And what I've noticed, I work mostly in education and workforce spaces where a lot of this is trying to be in service of academic achievement and ultimately economic mobility, is that those engineering feats often fail to provide experiences that actually foster in-groupness, that they can either have a very assimilationist bent and also very reductionist. Like networking events are hell on earth, in part because they're not designed to create shared experiences that can start to be the foundation of feeling like you belong to another person or another group, and also because they're not spaces that can allow people from different ethnic or income or racial backgrounds to surface what Adam Grant calls uncommon commonalities. The things that actually bond us even more than things that we look the same or come from the same background. But a lot of times we create these kind of social capital building opportunities that stay very at the surface, and therefore I would argue backfire. So that's like one thing I was hearing. I'm also glad Mike brought up the American dream because what I've observed in education and workforce spaces, as these fields become a little more vocal about the power of social capital, because bear in mind, everyone in power in these spaces has benefited from social capital by and large. I've observed that like as we start to sort of say it out loud more, the myth of meritocracy really rears its head. And it's a myth for a lot of reasons, partly because the word meritocracy was created in the 1950s as a farce, but we act in America as though it was like handed down, etched in stone somewhere and is, inevitably part of our social structure. But the way in which the myth of meritocracy rears its head is that people start talking about building social capital as a skill. They're like, is this a skill set? And there's a component, a lot of sociologists will include the ability to mobilize a network in their definition of social capital. It's not just that I know people, it's that I know how to be in reciprocal relationship and sort of exchange resources with them. But the temptation I see is sort of we reduce social capital to the idea of networking and the idea of networking to a skill set, and we totally disregard the access piece. What relationships do you have access to by virtue of the neighborhood you were born in, the institutions that you attend, et cetera, et cetera? And it just flagrantly ignores the structures that shape the networks people have access to, that they inherit, that are served up to them just by going to school or living their life, that we know, and Mike, I might be using the word design wrong, but our systems have been designed to afford access to certain types of networks to certain people, right? Whether it's through racial segregation, school segregation, occupational segregation, even within the same company or workplace. And so that, like, it sounds so subtle to be like, we're going to teach networking or we're going to teach social capital, but underneath that is a whole bunch of assumptions and sort of, I would argue, convenient ways to set access aside, even though I would argue access is sort of the core issue. If we're trying to go all the way back, Elizabeth, to where you started us, that we have routinely cut off access to certain types of networks, whether by race or income or gender. Um, Last thing I'll say here, because we can't have a panel in 2026 and not say the word AI, although Mike said LLM, so we did touch on it already. Um, I'm really worried about this reductionist view becoming even more insidious in the age of AI. Because with generative conversational AI, we have this other way that we're starting to generate, like, basically synthetic social capital, right? I can go and talk to a chatbot that can give me quote unquote personalized, I think actually personalized, but I'm putting in quotes for dramatic effect, but personalized information, advice, guidance, and the like. And we're basically giving people a giant self-help machine. And what I'm worried is going to happen is we're going to say, see, people love to say this, we're democratizing access to information and resources and advice. What are we still not democratizing? Access to networks, particularly into the knowledge economy, right? So you're going to have people getting better career advice from bots, but still not having access to the networks they need to get the jobs they want if they've been routinely shut out of those networks. So I just think AI is, in my language of disruptive innovation, a sustaining innovation. It's just like we're just continuing to go up market with this idea that this is just a skills piece and the access piece we're going to kind of set aside. So I don't know if that makes sense, but that's sort of how I see well-intentioned but misguided efforts to quote unquote build social capital, um, kind of reinforcing some of these myths that have created social capital gaps in the first place.
Hmm. This is so, so vital. Thank you all. And would love to open it up more to a conversation between the three of you to dig more deeply into what you've already started to share, just naming how obviously social networks are not neutral. And to really help us understand how you are seeing in your specific areas of work, the networks and social capital really actually furthering inequity, and not actually alleviating it, which you've each touched on. But I'd love if you can share more specific examples of what is keeping you up at night, what you're seeing that you really want to challenge our community and our society to pay attention to and to confront with more courage. Anyone can jump in that wants to begin. Thank you so much. I might have to call on someone. Um, Really, anything you want to share, just more to deepen the conversation about how you see this
Yeah.
playing.
I think so there's a lot of things that keep me up at night. I have a colleague on here and we were together yesterday. Shout out to Shanice at Howard University. And we were just talking about all the things that both inspire us but also keep us up at night. Uh so I'll try to whittle that list down a bit. You know, I'd say maybe there's two major buckets of things that keep me up at night. One comes from the brilliance and the work of John Powell and his team at the I'm going to botch the name of his center, but it's a fantastic place. Please look into the work of John Paul, the Belonging Institute. Sorry, I had to think very hard for a second. Uh, John Powell at a conference that I was in Chicago, maybe it's got to be like 10 years ago now, talked about social capital theory. And I had my own hunches. And I think a lot of people that do the kind of work we all do you that where we're not just theorists, we're practitioners, we're designers, we're unlearners, right? We're doing all the things to try to figure out how do you move yourself first forward in the world towards the humanity or this idea of shared humanity I think we all have. And I think the other larger thing there is like, how do you move a society that way bit by bit? And I think anyone that's been doing this work and thinking about relationships, right? We're saying social capital, but we're really talking about something that's core and fundamental to the fact that, like, as an organism, we are social. Like, legitimately, it is built into our biological nature. We will not survive. An infant will not survive if there is not something a little bit older, at least 5 to 6 years older than it, that can look at it and go, you need my protection. I have skill to do that. Let me hold you, grab you, feed you. Let's run from danger together, etc. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here online. I bring all that up because there is also the opposite thing that we are watching happen that I think Cell talked about really, really well. The way in grouping creates this other thing very fast without, I think, people even knowing. And so John Powell started to talk about that as breaking in the context of social capital theory, right? That there's bonding and bridging capital, but there might be another form that we need to name. This particular intentional or unintentional even, but there is, I think we could all agree, there is something happening that is intentional about eroding trust and eroding relationship and eroding believability in larger institutions, in data, and science, in each other, and humans. And that is a little scary, like, no, I'm gonna change my language. That's very scary. Like, it makes me very uncomfortable. But that is a thing, whether conscious or not, is happening. And we need to directly get into the why. We need to practice compassionate curiosity. We need to learn to listen more. We need to ask deeper questions. We need to unlearn. We need to examine our own positionality. I grew up poor. I grew up in all these other things as a young Black male, and I'm no longer there anymore, technically, in terms of class, but it's viscerally a part of my experience. So, first inward journey, how am I making sense of where I'm at right now? To recognize, even if it's just a little bit more power than I had when I was 13, what is that? And what does that mean for where I am right now? And what does that mean in the context of the world around me? So I think that kind of deep introspection is something that all of us, regardless of our race, gender, ethnicity, et cetera, however we're identifying, we need to do. And then the second bucket, I'll keep even briefer. I think we need more tools for that quickly, right? Like cognitive behavioral therapy has some great tools for going into the narrative dig of ourselves as individual, but also these larger systems. Because that narrative dig is a belief into a window into our beliefs. And it gives us a window into how we're organizing and perceiving the world, and starts to give us opportunity to start playing with different aspects of the individual and society so that we can get to, like, here's a lever for some change at some point of influence, and we can do something, whether it's on my block, whether it's in my head and with me, or whether it's the whole nation. We cannot we cannot succumb to the narrative of powerlessness, even though it's prevalent. And I think this social capital piece with the dynamics and everything Julia just laid out for so many people just reinforces, like, I don't have any power. I don't have, and I'm not saying that there is not an imbalance of power. There clearly is, but I don't think we're going to get anywhere if we can't find the center of our locus of control, and with some of this information start figuring out how do we strategically find the uncommon commonalities with each other to form some new types of bonds that are, I think, relevant for the 22nd century, right?
This has all been so fascinating. If we have time, I want to express something which is not fully formulated, but relates to this idea of like what's keeping you up at night. And it's got AI in it, so so there's that. I'm wondering, and yeah, other people on the panel, other people in the chat, I'm like, yeah, seeking views. I don't have a fully formed thought about it, but AI lowers the barrier to entry for any written task to basically zero. Um, and job applications are this kind of task. And so I wonder if um, the rise of the LLM is, in a way, sort of inversely related to the extent to which one needs to rely on a network to find work. And so this is something I worry about. So for many of us who have come from, let's say, not traditional backgrounds and made it, had this sort of meritocratic, life experience or whatever, right? Oftentimes it's come from you spent a long time, you learned some stuff, you filled in some application form, and you got lucky and you got into some kind of organization which allowed you to have this kind of trajectory. And I just wonder if that door is sort of closing in a way. Because as the barrier to entry becomes so small, number of applications rises exponentially. Now they're using AI to screen the applications. I think someone's already put in the chat that we know there's like algorithmic bias and so on. What's going to be acceptable to the AI might not be what someone from a working class background or a non-traditional background is going to write. So how do we get difference in a context where all things are done by ultimately the same machine? So yes, like I agree, Julia, like it is personalized. I'm kind of scared about like my AI chat history now. I'm like, oh, actually some American corporation, which I know nothing about, knows a lot of secrets about me, or well, they're not secrets, but things that I'm thinking about that I'm not sharing with other human beings, right? They know all of this stuff. So yes, it's personalized to me, but at the same time, the tool itself is just the same tool that everyone else is using, right? This is one model ultimately. Anyway, I suppose the point I'm getting at is that I think social connection, social capital, um, was already extremely important in terms of who gets what kind of outcome. But I think that is on a trajectory of becoming more important even, and therefore by, you know, yeah, by contrast, your ability to make movements and steps in your own life on your own 2 feet is declining actually. So yeah, anyway, thoughts. Julia, you look like you have some.
Yeah, well, there's anecdotal evidence here in the US that that is happening, that referrals are becoming more important as employers are inundated with AI created applications, right? So the irony though in this moment that maybe you're getting at is that social capital is becoming more valuable and also more vulnerable. Right. I would argue we are disrupting our weak tie networks as we turn to AI for help instead of one another. I would argue that help seeking avoidance has a great home in an LLM. And help seeking avoidance isn't just like a bad trait. If you've looked for help before and been rejected or turned away, help seeking avoidance is a rational response. So like very concerned about what you're describing. Um, I spent the last week, I'm going down the AI hole, Elizabeth, and then you'll pull us back. But I spent the last week interviewing young people who are turning to AI for companionship. And in 95% of the interviews, we were the first conversation they had ever had with anyone about this relationship they were forming with AI. So I just think the relational story that AI is writing for us right now or with us right now is not fully told. We're not talking about it out loud, and it's gonna pop up in all sorts of ways that impact our networks. The only other thing that keeps me up at night that kind of goes up to this macro level of how are we designing systems is that I started this work about 10 years ago, um, really inspired by the work of Mario Louise Small, who's a sociologist who's written amazing stuff about social capital, including a book called Unanticipated Gains, where he basically argued our institutions are brokers of social capital, but most of them are not doing that in purposeful ways. It's like you run into each other when you drop your kid off at daycare. The daycare has not designed itself to be a networking hub for parents or what have you. And so I read his work, super inspired, and came up with a little technocrat fantasy that, like, great, we could make institutions like schools purposeful brokers of social capital. And here I am 10 years later, like ready to just still die on that hill because our institutions are so calcified that it's, whoa, I don't know why that just happened on my screen. It's like, stop talking, like big mic drop moment. Our institutions are calcified. I'll leave it at that. And so what, how do we design towards something different given the stuckness of our institutions in this non-purposeful broker thing? So.
I was just at Stanford recently, and Dr. Jonathan Chen also clarified some concern for me that AI is designed for engagement, not correctness, and that being baked into the design of AI will really further, right? Like it will tell you what you want to hear. You have to tell it, don't do that. And that can help with accuracy, but it truly is just going to amplify the existing and very concerning dynamics that we've seen at play for hundreds of years. So the intention that you're each bringing is so meaningful, and I want to thank you so much for your amazing insights, and just really naming that, yeah, like the answer here is not just like as you all have discussed in the past, like to have rich people meet poor people, right? Like that should not be the outcome that we all think will fix this. And as this AI era increases, we really are going to have to continue to pay attention to that. And I see that in Reckon With's work all the time, where white people are like, "Oh, I'll just not talk to the white people. I'll just go and make friends with a black person or a poor black person, and that will fix it." And of course, the whole point is you are gatekeeping the ways that the power system can actually change if you actually do go talk to your other rich white wealthy friends about why the policies and the inequities exist, and that how we're keeping those going. So there's so much wonderful, rich content. Thank you all. We're now going to move into reflection because we want to give you all time to sit with what has come up.